Hello everyone, in this video we're going to be looking at the skull anatomy of birds, well specifically in this video the cranial anatomy of corvids, the family of birds that includes everything from ravens to crows to jays to magpies and so on. Before we dive into this video, don't forget to give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. So this is the skull of a common raven, which is the largest of all corvids that we have in the UK. Although there's many different kinds of corvids that live throughout the world, and there are many different species of ravens that vary a little bit in coloration and in sizes and in habitats. But this is your standard corvid skull here. And ravens are of course the largest of all the corvids, and they are also the largest in the family of birds known as passerines, which are a family often referred to as perching birds. So everything from your sparrows to your finches to your starlings to your thrushes and blackbirds, right up to corvids, which include jays, magpies, jackdaws, nutcrackers, crows, rooks, and of course this guy, the raven. So looking at the skull of this raven, I think the first thing that comes to your attention when you look at it is of course this really large beak, which is large even by the standards of other corvid species. Ravens have an especially large and heavy beak, which is a feature that you can often notice even when you see a live bird in flight. It stands out a lot. Now, common ravens are pretty large birds anyway. In fact, they have a wingspan, the UK ravens at least, have a wingspan of around the size of a common buzzard, and they have an even larger body, so they're a very large, powerful bird. But this is by far their most effective and powerful asset, is their head and their beak. Looking at the skull of this raven, you'll notice at the very end of its upper beak, or its upper mandible if you will, there's a very slight bump or hook that you can see here. And it's not as pronounced as you would see, say for example, on a bird of prey, but it's enough to notice that they have a small projection at the end, and this is a feature that they use to tear up their food. Corvids' beaks are almost like a multi-tool. They use them for a range of different tasks. They can use them to pick and gouge out food. They can use their beaks to dig up worms and other food in the ground. In fact, corvids in this country are often blamed for a lot of damage to agricultural land because large flocks of ravens, but especially also crows and rooks, will dig up the turf in search of food, because this beak is an especially powerful tool. You'll also notice looking at this specimen that the skull itself, compared to other birds, is very tightly fused. If you see that the skull and beak are very tightly fused together on top, that makes the skull very rigid indeed compared to other birds, which makes their skull a little bit more inflexible than some other bird species of a similar size. But the trade-off, of course, is it makes their beak especially rigid and resistant, so they're very effective at pecking at hard surfaces and digging for food. Another feature of this specimen that I find quite interesting, which is something that you do see in a lot of bird skulls as well as just corvids, you see it in birds of prey for example, is if you look from the underside, you'll notice that the two eye sockets are separated by a very, very thin sheet of bone. In fact, if I turn it this way, you can actually see the bone is so thin there's a tiny hole in it, but it's an incredibly thin sheet of bone that separates the two eyeballs from each other, which is quite remarkable. Of course, in some birds of prey, the eyeballs in proportion to the skull are much larger than even some corvids, which of course makes their vision incredibly good. And it's quite incredible though that their eyeballs are more or less really close to each other inside the skull, but still not actually touching. The actual cranium, or the top of the skull in this raven, as is for most of the corvids, like I said, is very tightly fused compared to other birds, but the actual cranial surface area is also quite enlarged, much more so than in a similar sized bird. As you can see, it's quite a large cranium in relation to the rest of the skull. You can see the skull itself is quite big, as my hand for comparison. And this of course corresponds to the fact that corvids are renowned to be one of, if not the most intelligent of all bird species, of all bird families in the world, as they have, for their size, a relatively large amount of grey and white matter in terms of like brain to body ratio, which, as you can see, is contained all in this area of the skull. Really quite large cranium by bird standards. In fact, it's said that if a corvid like this were the same size as a chimpanzee, both animals would have a brain of a comparable size, which is quite remarkable. But corvids are shown both in captivity and in the wild across the world that they are proven to be incredibly intelligent animals. They're said to have the problem-solving ability of a 7-year-old child, and they can even imitate human speech and make a wide range of vocalizations, many of which most people don't even know they can make. Although I'm sure there's loads of videos on YouTube you can search for that shows ravens and crows and other corvids imitating human speech and performing all kinds of incredible tricks and various tasks in order to find food, both in the wild and also in captivity. Thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed this short video on a little bit of an anatomy talk on the skull of birds like corvids, like this, a bird that's very common in many ways across the world, but they don't always get recognised in terms of their unique anatomy and also their intelligence. If you like this video, give this video a like, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. Until next time, I shall see you in the next one.